The war on the planet Arkan had dragged on for weeks, and there seemed to be no end in sight. The landscape was a mix of craters, scorched earth, and the remains of broken machines. The air was thick with smoke, the sky often darkened by the constant explosions echoing across the horizon. In the midst of this chaos, a group of human soldiers had been sent as part of a peacekeeping mission. Their job was simple: to try and help bring an end to the conflict between two warring alien factions. But what was meant to be a diplomatic mission quickly turned into a fight for survival. James was one of those soldiers. He had been trained for this kind of situation, but nothing had truly prepared him for the harsh reality of war. It wasn't just the constant noise of gunfire and explosions that unsettled him. It was the unpredictability of it all. Every moment felt like it could be his last, and the sense of uncertainty weighed heavily on his mind. The enemy forces were relentless, and James's unit had already faced a number of attacks. The communication systems had gone down early in the battle, leaving them stranded in the middle of a foreign world with no way to call for backup. James had no idea where his comrades were now, only that he had lost contact with them hours ago. He had been moving cautiously through the wreckage of what had once been a massive enemy ship. His boots crunched against the gravel, his rifle held tightly in his hands. There was a sinking feeling in his gut, but he refused to let fear control him. He needed to keep moving, to find some kind of shelter, something to help him survive. As he rounded a corner of the shattered ship, something caught his eye. A flash of movement. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it was enough to make him pause. James's hand instinctively tightened around the rifle's grip, but he didn't raise it yet. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his eyes scanning the area. Then he saw her. Lying on the ground, barely conscious, was a young alien girl. She was half hidden beneath a fallen piece of debris, her body bruised and covered in cuts. Blood stained her clothes, and her eyes were closed as if she were drifting in and out of consciousness. At first, James didn't understand what he was seeing. He had never encountered an alien like this before. Her features were delicate and striking. Long, silvery hair, skin the color of moonlight, and sharp, angular features. There was an air of nobility about her, something that made James feel uneasy, like she was someone important. His first instinct was to keep moving. She could be a trap, some kind of enemy soldier trying to lure him in. But the sounds of war raged in the distance, and the smoke in the air was thick enough to make it hard to breathe. There was no way she could have survived this battle alone. James hesitated for a moment, then made up his mind. He couldn't just leave her there. He rushed over to her, scanning his surroundings once more to make sure no one else was nearby. As he knelt beside her, he noticed the faint rise and fall of her chest. She was alive, but just barely. He quickly checked her wounds, trying to assess the damage. Her injuries were serious, but nothing he couldn't handle with the right supplies. He had a basic first aid kit in his pack, though he wasn't sure how much good it would do. Still, he had to try. "Come on, stay with me," James muttered under his breath as he carefully moved the debris off her body. His fingers worked quickly, though his movements were gentle, as he cleaned the blood from her face and checked for any signs of a concussion. She stirred slightly, her eyes flickering open for just a moment. She tried to speak, but her voice was weak, barely a whisper. James couldn't understand what she said, but the panic in her eyes told him everything. She was scared. James wasn't sure why, but he felt a sense of responsibility wash over him. He couldn't leave her to die here. Not like this. He gently lifted her into his arms, careful not to make her wounds worse. Her body was small and light, but there was an odd strength in the way she held herself, as if she were someone who had been trained for something greater than just survival. "Don't worry," James said, his voice soft but steady. "I'm going to get you out of here." The journey ahead would be dangerous. There were still enemy forces nearby, and the planet's terrain was harsh, but James didn't care. He couldn't leave her, not when she needed help the most. As he moved away from the wreckage and into the dense, darkened forest that lay ahead, James had no idea who this girl was or what her role was in the war. But deep down, he felt a strange pull, as if this simple act of kindness had set him on a path he couldn't yet see, a path that would change both their lives forever. The days passed slowly after James found the alien girl, now identified as Ayla. He had taken her deep into the forest, away from the battlefield. The dense trees and thick underbrush made it difficult for him to move quickly, but it was the safest place he could think of. The war raged on in the distance, the sound of explosions echoing through the air. But here, it was peaceful, almost eerily so. The quiet allowed James to focus on the task at hand, keeping Ayla alive and getting her back to safety. He found a small, secluded area beneath a cluster of tall trees where he could set up camp. The ground was uneven, but at least it offered some cover from any potential threats. James wasn't sure how long they'd be stuck out here, but he was determined to protect her as best he could. Ayla had been unconscious for most of the first day after he found her. Her injuries were serious, but not life-threatening, as far as James could tell. She had a deep gash on her arm, and her face was bruised from the crash. Her skin, though different from his, was a soft shade of silvery blue that seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. Her eyes, when they were open, were large in a pale, shimmering shade of violet. There was something otherworldly about her, but beneath the strange beauty of her appearance, James saw vulnerability. Over the next few days, Ayla slowly regained her strength. She sat up and tried to speak, though her voice was faint and weak at first. Her language was unlike anything James had ever heard. It was soft, melodic, almost musical, and the words didn't make sense to him. He wished he could understand her, but it didn't matter. Communication, at least for now, was impossible. Still, there was something in her eyes that James couldn't ignore, something that made him feel like she was trying to tell him something important. James tried his best to communicate with her, even though he had no idea how to. He offered her water, pointing to the container and then to her, hoping she understood. She gave him a small nod, her gaze soft but grateful. Each time he did something kind, like offering her food or helping her move, Ayla seemed to relax a little more. There was trust in her eyes now, trust that had slowly built from his actions, not words. After 3 days, Ayla's voice grew a little stronger. She spoke again, and though James couldn't understand, the words had a rhythm that suggested she was trying to explain something. She pointed to herself, then made a gesture to the sky, her hand sweeping across the open sky above them. James was unsure what it meant, but he guessed she was referring to her home or people. He had learned by now that Ayla wasn't just any ordinary alien. She carried herself differently. Her movements were graceful, controlled, as if every action had purpose. Even the way she sat was elegant, as though she were used to a higher standard of life. It became clear to James that Ayla wasn't just any survivor of the battle. She was different, special, somehow. The next day, Ayla's wounds were healing well. She even tried to stand, though she was still weak. James watched her closely, making sure she didn't push herself too hard. Despite the strange circumstances, he couldn't help but feel a sense of admiration for her resilience. She was determined, even in her weakened state. Ayla gave him a grateful smile, and for the first time, she reached out and placed her hand on his arm. It was a simple gesture, but it made James feel something unexpected: connection. The touch, though brief, left a warm feeling in his chest. In that moment, something shifted. He realized he wasn't just helping her survive. He was beginning to care about her. As the days passed, they started to fall into a routine. James would search for food, foraging for what he could find in the wilderness. Sometimes, Ayla would point to the sky or the distant mountains, as if trying to say something he didn't quite understand. She seemed to be looking for something, as though her mind was still far from this place, caught in the memories of the battle that had left her stranded here. One evening, as the sun set and the sky turned a soft orange, Ayla tried to speak again. This time, her voice was stronger. Aye. Ayla, she said, her words slow and clear. James didn't understand at first, but then it hit him. She was introducing herself. Ayla, James repeated softly, nodding as if confirming it was her name. She smiled weakly, then gestured to herself again. She seemed to want him to understand who she was, but James was still confused. He didn't know if she was part of one of the alien factions at war, or if she was a simple civilian. He didn't know what she needed or how to help her beyond keeping her alive. Despite the language barrier, there was something comforting about the way they communicated. It was through small gestures, shared looks, and the unspoken trust that grew between them. James had never expected to find himself in such a situation. But here he was, stuck on an alien world with a mysterious girl who might be more important than he could imagine. Ayla's gaze seemed to say more than words ever could. She wasn't just a survivor. She was someone special, and James had no idea just how deep the mystery went. As they sat together that evening, watching the stars above, James couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken an unexpected turn, and that Ayla's story was far from over. James sat by the campfire, the flickering flames casting shadows on the forest floor. The night was quiet, save for the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze and the occasional crackling of the firewood. He stared into the fire, lost in thought. The days had been difficult, but there was something about Ayla that kept him from feeling truly alone. She was healing, her strength returning little by little, but James couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than he understood. The two of them had settled into a routine. James would go out to search for food, sometimes bringing back fruits and vegetables he had found deep in the forest. Ayla would rest, or sometimes wander around the camp, her sharp eyes always alert, as if watching for danger. She rarely spoke, but when she did, it was usually in that soft, melodic language James still couldn't understand. Her eyes told a story he wasn't fully grasping, but there was something in the way she looked at him that made him feel important, as if he had a purpose beyond just surviving. Tonight, however, something felt different. Ayla had been quiet for most of the day, staring off into the distance, her thoughts far away. James noticed her gaze was more focused than usual, her eyes fixed on the horizon as if searching for something. After a long while, she stood up and walked over to him, her movements fluid, almost graceful. James looked up as she approached, sensing the change in her mood. She stopped in front of him, and then slowly pointed towards the sky, her hand tracing the outline of a distant star. Her voice, still soft but clearer than before, spoke in that strange language, though James could make out the urgency in her tone. Star, she said, her eyes filled with determination. James frowned, still unsure of what she was trying to say, but he caught the word star. He glanced at the sky, his eyes following the direction her finger was pointing. The stars sparkled brightly above them, each one a tiny beacon in the endless night. Ayla turned to him and repeated her words more slowly. Star. Home. The realization hit James like a wave. She wasn't just pointing at the sky randomly. She was talking about her home. The stars were calling her back, and the journey back was as important to her as anything else. Ayla wasn't just a survivor of the battle. She was trying to return home, back to her people. James felt a weight in his chest as he understood the depth of what she was saying. She had been stranded here, caught in the middle of a conflict that was not hers to fight. Her people, whoever they were, must have been on the other side of the galaxy, far away. He looked at her, his thoughts racing. He had only been trying to protect her, but now he realized that protecting her meant something much more. He wasn't just keeping her alive. He was part of something bigger, something he didn't fully understand. He didn't know how to get her back to her home, or even if it was possible, but he knew he couldn't leave her stranded here. Ayla took a few steps back, then crouched down to the ground. She began to draw in the dirt with her finger, making strange symbols and lines that seemed to have meaning. James watched curiously, wondering if this was her way of explaining where she was from. The shapes were intricate, unlike anything he had seen before. "Home," Ayla said again, her voice firm now. "Safe." James knelt down beside her, trying to make sense of the symbols. But they were unlike any language he knew. He realized then that Ayla's world was far more complex than he had imagined. She wasn't just an ordinary alien. She was part of something powerful, something far beyond the understanding of a simple soldier like himself. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence. It was distant at first, but growing louder. A low hum, like the sound of machinery. James's heart skipped a beat. He immediately rose to his feet, eyes scanning the trees around them. Was it an enemy ship? Another attack? Ayla stood up quickly, her body tense, and her eyes wide with fear. She didn't speak, but the way she looked at James told him everything. Whatever this noise was, it wasn't good. James's hand gripped his rifle instinctively, but he didn't know where the danger was coming from. The noise grew louder, and then, from the sky above them, a shadow passed over the camp. The hum became a roar, and the ground seemed to tremble beneath their feet. "Get down," James shouted, pulling Ayla to the ground beside him. They both lay flat against the dirt as a large spacecraft zoomed overhead. It was sleek, almost invisible in the dark sky, except for the faint lights that shimmered along its edges. James had never seen anything like it before. The ship seemed to move without a sound, its presence felt only by the rush of air as it passed overhead. Ayla's eyes were wide with recognition. She didn't look afraid, though. She was looking at the ship as if she had seen it before, as if it were something she knew, something she had been waiting for. The ship continued its path toward the horizon, disappearing into the distance. The noise faded away, and all that remained was the eerie quiet of the forest. James looked at Ayla, his heart racing. That was your ship?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Ayla's gaze never wavered from the sky. Slowly, she nodded. "Yes," she said, her voice soft but full of certainty. "Home." The sound of the mysterious ship faded into the night, leaving behind only the quiet rustling of leaves in the forest. James couldn't take his eyes off the sky. That ship, it was unlike anything he had ever seen before. The way it moved, so fast and silent, left him with more questions than answers. Who was it? Was it her people? And why hadn't they landed to help her? Beside him, Ayla remained silent, her gaze still fixed on the sky. She hadn't spoken since the ship passed overhead, but James could see the tension in her posture. Her body was stiff, as if she were holding back something. He had the feeling that she knew something he didn't, and it was making him uneasy. James glanced at her, his voice soft but urgent. "Ayla, do you know who they are? Your people?" Ayla turned her head slowly to face him. Her eyes, still that strange violet hue, seemed to be searching his face for understanding. She opened her mouth to speak, but then stopped. She looked as though she wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Danger," she said simply, her voice trembling. "Not safe." James felt a chill run down his spine. Whatever Ayla was trying to warn him about, it was serious. He didn't know if it was the ship or something else, but he could see the fear in her eyes now. She wasn't just trying to get home. She was trying to escape something far more dangerous. "We need to get you out of here," James said firmly, his mind racing. "If they're after you, we can't stay here. We'll move you to another location, somewhere safe." Ayla shook her head, her expression hardening as if she were making a decision. She reached out and placed her hand gently on James's arm, looking at him with a mixture of gratitude and resolve. "Not leave," she said. "Need fight." James blinked in confusion. Fight? He wasn't sure he understood. Fight what? Fight who? Ayla's gaze darkened, and she turned her head back to the direction the ship had disappeared. "Enemies," she whispered. "I must stop them. Protect." James felt a surge of confusion and uncertainty. Ayla wasn't just a helpless survivor. She had a purpose. She wasn't asking to be rescued. She was asking for help to fight. But James was no soldier. He was just a man trying to survive the war, trying to do the right thing. But helping her fight, that was something he wasn't sure he was ready for. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing thoughts. Ayla, I don't know if I can help you fight. I'm not prepared for something like this. Ayla's eyes softened as if she understood. She gave him a small nod and placed her hand on his chest, her fingers lightly touching the fabric of his jacket. Not alone, she said simply. You. Help me. Together. James looked into her eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. She was looking to him for support, and there was something in her eyes that made him want to say yes. He didn't know who these enemies were, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't leave Ayla alone to face them. He nodded slowly. Okay, he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty. I'll help you. But we need to figure out a plan. We can't just rush into this. Ayla smiled faintly, the first real smile he had seen from her in days. Thank you, she said softly, her voice full of relief. The two of them spent the rest of the night planning. Ayla told him what little she could about the enemy she was up against, though her language was still a barrier. From what James could gather, she was part of a royal family, or at least that's what he thought she meant when she made the gesture of a crown above her head. Whoever her enemies were, they were after her, and they wouldn't stop until they had her. James didn't know how they could possibly win against these enemies, especially without knowing who they were or what kind of power they had. But he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to leave her side. If there was even the slightest chance they could stop these enemies together, he would help her. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something bigger. It was about protecting someone who needed him. As dawn began to break, the first light of the day creeping through the trees, James and Ayla prepared to leave their camp. They packed what little supplies they had left and started to move deeper into the forest. James wasn't sure where they were going, but he knew they couldn't stay in one place for too long. The enemies could be close, and they needed to stay ahead of them. Ayla seemed more determined now. Her pace was steady, and her movements were purposeful. James couldn't help but admire her strength. Even after everything she had been through, she was still fighting. She wasn't just going to sit back and wait for someone to save her. She was going to take action. And now, James was going to help her, no matter what it took. They traveled for hours, moving through the dense forest. The sounds of the battle from earlier seemed far behind them now, but James couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Something dangerous. As they made their way through the woods, Ayla suddenly stopped and turned to face James. Her eyes were wide with warning, and she raised a hand, signaling for him to be quiet. James immediately fell silent, his senses on high alert. He listened carefully, trying to hear what had made her stop. A faint sound reached his ears, the hum of engines. The enemies were here. The sound of the engines grew louder, cutting through the quiet of the forest. James and Ayla froze, both of them tense, their eyes scanning the trees around them. The engines weren't close yet, but they were coming. The enemy was near. Ayla motioned for James to follow her as she crouched low to the ground, her movements swift and careful. She moved like someone who knew exactly how to hide in the wilderness, blending into the shadows. James struggled to match her pace, trying to keep his footsteps light. It was hard to move silently with the heavy pack on his back, but he did his best to keep up. His heart pounded in his chest, and every rustling leaf felt like a shout in the silence. They slipped behind a large rock, where Ayla signaled for James to stop. She looked around, her eyes sharp, scanning the landscape. James tried to peer through the trees, but he couldn't see anything yet. He could only hear the steady hum of the engines. Whoever the enemy was, they were closing in. Ayla turned to James, her expression serious. She whispered, "Hide. They look for me." James nodded, understanding the urgency. He dropped to his knees behind the rock, pressing himself against the cool stone. Ayla did the same, her body blending into the shadows beside him. They waited in silence, the minutes stretching on like hours. James's breathing felt too loud in his ears. Every time a bird flapped its wings or a branch snapped underfoot, his heart skipped a beat. Then, through the trees, James saw them. Two figures, tall and menacing, appeared on the edge of the clearing. They weren't human. Their movements were too fluid, too fast. Their skin was a strange grayish hue, and their eyes were dark, almost black. They looked like something out of a nightmare. One of them carried a weapon, a long, sleek rifle, while the other was looking around cautiously, scanning the area. James held his breath, trying to make himself as invisible as possible. His heart raced, and he had to force himself to stay still. Ayla was right next to him, her eyes locked on the figures. She was tense, but there was no sign of fear in her. She was a survivor. She had faced dangers like this before, and she wasn't about to let them catch her. The two figures moved closer, stopping just a few feet from where James and Ayla hid. They seemed to be searching for something or someone. James barely dared to breathe, knowing that if they were spotted, there would be no chance of escaping. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had to stay calm. He had to think. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't trained to fight, but he had to protect Ayla. She needed him. They both needed each other. The figures exchanged a few words in a language James didn't understand. It sounded harsh, cold. They moved further into the forest, searching the ground, scanning for any sign of Ayla. James watched as they stepped closer to where they were hiding. He could see their weapons glinting in the low light, and his mind raced. He had to act fast. Without a word, Ayla moved first. She was quick, and before James could even react, she had slipped out from behind the rock and into the trees. Her movements were like a shadow, swift and silent. James's heart jumped into his throat. He wanted to call out to her, but he knew that would give them away. He held his breath, watching the enemies. The two figures looked confused for a moment, but then one of them turned and began to follow Ayla's path. The other stayed behind, still scanning the ground. James didn't know what Ayla had planned, but he trusted her. She had to know what she was doing. The enemy following Ayla was moving fast, but Ayla was faster. She darted between trees, weaving in and out of the shadows, using the forest to her advantage. James could barely see her anymore, but he could hear the soft sound of her footsteps, growing fainter as she led the enemy away. The second enemy stood still for a moment longer, still searching. James knew that he couldn't just sit and wait. He had to do something. He had to help her. He slowly rose to his feet, keeping low, and moved quietly toward the enemy who was still searching. His heart was pounding, his mind racing with thoughts of what he could do. He wasn't a fighter, but he had to protect Ayla. He had to help her escape. The enemy wasn't paying attention. James moved carefully, staying behind trees, using the cover of the forest to stay hidden. He didn't know what he would do once he got close, but he had to act. Every step felt like an eternity, but he finally reached a small tree just behind the enemy soldier. His breath caught in his throat as he crouched down, trying to stay out of sight. Then, James saw it, a large branch hanging low above the enemy's head. It was risky, but it was his only chance. He reached up slowly, his hands trembling, and grabbed hold of the branch. He swung it down with all his strength, knocking the enemy off balance. The soldier stumbled backward, surprised, but James didn't wait to see what happened next. He darted into the trees, following Ayla's path. His heart was racing now, adrenaline surging through his veins. He couldn't hear anything but the pounding of his own heartbeat and the sound of his breath. He had no idea if his move had worked, but he wasn't going to stop now. Ayla was ahead, and James was going to make sure they both made it out alive. James's legs were burning as he sprinted through the dense forest, his breath ragged and his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't see Ayla anymore, but he knew she was somewhere ahead, weaving through the trees, staying just ahead of their pursuers. The enemy was close. He could feel it. They weren't far behind, and he could hear their voices, sharp and cold, shouting commands in a language he didn't understand. He glanced over his shoulder. The first enemy soldier had recovered from the shock of James's attack and was now in pursuit. The second soldier had also regrouped, both of them working together to track down Ayla. James had to catch up, but he knew it was a dangerous game. He couldn't outrun them forever. A flicker of movement caught his eye. Ayla. She had turned a corner in the trees, just ahead of him. Her figure was barely visible through the thick underbrush. But James spotted her. She looked back, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. She was in full survival mode, calm and determined, but he could see the strain on her face. She was pushing herself harder than ever. Ayla raised her hand, signaling for James to follow. Without a second thought, James picked up his pace, weaving through the trees, trying to close the distance. His mind raced. What was she planning? They couldn't keep running like this forever. They needed a way out. A plan. They reached a small clearing in the forest. Ayla stopped abruptly, and James almost ran into her. She was panting, her face focused, as she glanced around the area. The trees formed a thick barrier on one side, but there was a narrow gap between them that led deeper into the woods. "We need to keep going," Ayla whispered, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "They're not far behind. We can't let them catch us." James nodded, though he was unsure where they were going. He was following her lead because she was the one who knew this forest, this land. He trusted her instincts. Just as they started to move again, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from behind them. The enemy was closing in. They had no time to waste. Ayla's eyes darted from one direction to the other. Then she made a decision. "This way," she said urgently, grabbing James's arm and pulling him toward the gap in the trees. They squeezed through, the branches scraping against their skin, but they kept going, moving as fast as they could. The forest was dense, but Ayla knew how to navigate it, ducking under low branches, jumping over fallen logs, and pushing through thick bushes with ease. James struggled to keep up. His breath was short, and his legs felt heavy, but he kept pushing forward. The enemy was close, and he couldn't afford to slow down. Finally, they reached a small ravine. The ground was steep and rocky, but there was a narrow path that led down to the bottom. Ayla hesitated for only a moment, then started down the path, careful but quick. James followed closely, his heart in his throat as he made his way down the rocky incline. The sounds of the enemy searching above them grew fainter, but he knew they couldn't rest yet. Not until they were completely safe. When they reached the bottom, they paused for a moment, catching their breath. The ravine was surrounded by thick trees, and the sounds of the enemy above were nearly gone. But Ayla wasn't relaxing. She was still on edge, scanning the area with sharp eyes. "Ayla, what now?" James asked, still trying to catch his breath. "How do we get out of here?" Ayla turned to him, her face serious. "We can't keep running. We have to face them. I can't keep running from this forever. Not when it's about to get much worse." James frowned. He didn't understand what she meant. "What do you mean? What's worse than this?" Ayla took a deep breath. "James, there's something I need to tell you. Something you should know about me. Something that might explain all of this." James listened, his concern growing. "What is it? You can tell me." She looked away for a moment, gathering her thoughts. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter. "I'm not just a survivor of this world, James. I'm not just a fighter. I'm someone much more important than that. I'm not just an ordinary person. I'm a princess, a future queen." James blinked, confused. "A queen? What are you talking about?" Ayla nodded, her gaze fixed on the ground. "I come from a royal family, one that has been in hiding for years. The war, the battles, they were all part of a bigger struggle. The people who are chasing us, they want to capture me. They want to control my world. They want to overthrow my family. James stood there, stunned. He had no idea. He had been rescuing a princess, someone with a destiny far beyond what he had imagined. So, all of this, it's about your family, your kingdom. Ayla nodded. Yes, but it's more than that. It's about the future of my people. If I don't make it, everything could be lost. My family, my kingdom, everything will fall. James felt the weight of her words. Suddenly, everything he had done, all the risks he had taken, seemed even more important. He wasn't just protecting Ayla anymore. He was helping to shape the future of her people, of an entire kingdom. We can't stop now, James said, determination rising within him. We'll find a way to get through this. Together. Ayla gave him a small, grateful smile. Together. But just as they were about to move forward, the sound of footsteps echoed from above. They weren't alone anymore. The footsteps grew louder. James and Ayla crouched behind a large rock, barely breathing as the enemy's soldiers passed by above the ravine. They had no more time to waste. Their pursuers were closer than ever. James could hear the sharp, metallic clinking of their armor as they moved, their voices cold and distant. But now, James understood that they weren't just after Ayla. They were after the throne, after control of an entire kingdom. We need to move, now, Ayla whispered urgently, her eyes locked on James. He could see the stress in her expression, but also a new kind of determination. She wasn't just running from danger anymore. She was preparing to face it head-on. James nodded, his mind racing. The weight of what Ayla had told him about being a future queen settled over him, and the stakes of this mission felt even higher. She wasn't just a person he was helping to survive. He was now part of something much larger. If they failed, it wasn't just their lives at risk. It was the future of her entire people. The two of them quickly gathered their things, making sure they were ready for whatever came next. Ayla led the way, her movements sure and quick, with James right behind her. They had to find shelter and regroup. There was no other option. They were cornered. Ayla stopped suddenly, her hand shooting out to stop James. She crouched, listening carefully. Through the thick trees, James could hear it too, the sound of distant voices and boots crunching on the forest floor. They were getting closer. Over there, Ayla said, pointing to a large, hollowed-out tree at the edge of the ravine. It was big enough to hide them for a moment. Without hesitation, they moved towards it, James's heart thundering in his chest. They crawled into the tree's hollow and waited in silence, trying to make themselves as small as possible. Time seemed to stretch on forever as they held their breath, listening to the enemy pass by above them. The tension was unbearable, but Ayla's calm presence next to him helped James focus. He had no idea how long they would need to stay hidden, but he knew they couldn't wait for too long. The enemy was still searching, and they wouldn't stop until they found them. Minutes passed. The voices grew fainter, and the footsteps slowly disappeared. But Ayla didn't move. She stayed still, her body rigid, eyes wide as she listened for any sign of danger. "We can't stay here forever," James said in a low voice. "We need to get back on the move." Ayla nodded, and finally, after a long silence, she gave him a quick glance. "We're running out of time, James. If we're going to do this, it has to be now." James raised an eyebrow. "Do what?" She gave him a serious look. "Fight back. The enemy is close, and we can't keep running forever. We'll be trapped, and then they'll have me. And once they have me, they'll control everything." James felt a surge of determination. He knew she was right. They couldn't just run away. He had to help her take back what was rightfully hers. Ayla stood up first, motioning for James to follow. "There's a way to do this. I have a plan. But I need your help." James felt a wave of responsibility wash over him. "Tell me what to do. I'm with you." They emerged from the hollow tree and started moving quickly, heading toward the enemy's last known location. Ayla's confidence seemed to have returned. She wasn't just running anymore. She was preparing for a fight. As they neared the enemy's camp, they saw it, a small, makeshift encampment guarded by a few soldiers. The enemy was regrouping, but they were still focused on tracking down their quarry. They didn't realize Ayla and James were so close. "We wait for the right moment," Ayla whispered. "When the soldiers split up to search, we take them down, one by one." James nodded, understanding her plan. They would have to be quick, silent, and precise. This wouldn't be easy, but it was their only shot at survival. The first soldier walked away from the camp, and Ayla motioned for James to follow. They moved like shadows, staying low and quiet. Ayla's training kicked in as she snuck up behind the soldier, grabbing him by the shoulders and pulling him into the trees. James was right behind her, ready to help if needed, but Ayla handled the soldier with ease. In a matter of seconds, he was down, unconscious. "Good work," James whispered. Ayla nodded, her eyes flashing with confidence. "Let's keep moving." They worked their way through the camp, taking down the soldiers one by one, moving quickly and silently. James's heart raced with every encounter. But Ayla was a natural leader, calm and precise in her movements. She knew exactly how to take control of the situation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last soldier fell. They were alone. The camp was theirs. Ayla stood tall, her breath steady, but her eyes fierce. "This is just the beginning. We've won this round, but the real battle is ahead." James couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and awe. He had followed her into battle, and now they had a chance. They had fought back together. "We'll finish this, Ayla," James said, his voice steady. "We'll win." Ayla smiled, the weight of her future still ahead of her, but her confidence renewed. "Yes, together." As they stood there, surrounded by the fallen soldiers, a new chapter was beginning for them both. The war wasn't over yet, but now they had a chance to win. They had taken the first step towards securing her kingdom, and with James by her side, Ayla knew they could face anything.